What if one soldier, alone on a dead world, was about to make history, and didn't even know it yet? Captain Ryden Oaks opened his eyes to the sound of alarms dying in his ears and smoke curling from a cracked instrument panel. His shuttle had gone down hard on Velura for a planet the Coalition's star charts listed as uninhabited, low priority, no strategic value. That classification was about to become the biggest lie in recent galactic history. He unbuckled himself, checked his ribs, and stepped out onto red dust under a sky the color of rust. For a moment, the silence felt almost peaceful. Then he saw the wreckage half a kilometer away. A raider vessel, hull torn open like a ripped can, its cargo bay spilling something dark and twitching into the canyon below. Scrath. Ryden had read the classified briefings. Bioengineered high predators, built for one purpose: total extermination of anything that moved. A single Scrath was dangerous. A cluster of 10 was a squad-level threat. What crawled out of that raider ship wasn't 10. It wasn't even 100. It was closer to 1,000. He watched them emerge in waves, segmented limbs clicking against stone, red optical sensors flickering awake one by one like a field of hungry stars. And then, as if some invisible signal passed between them, every single head turned his direction at once. His pulse spiked. His hand went to the sidearm out of pure instinct, a weapon that held maybe 40 seconds of sustained fire against a swarm this size. His transport, his only way off this planet, sat 3 kilometers away on the other side of that army. Most soldiers would have run. Ryden didn't. He forced his breathing to slow, the way he'd trained himself to do since his first deployment. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford, and he knew it. He dropped to one knee behind a boulder and did the only thing that had ever kept him alive in situations like this. He started counting distances, counting cover, counting how many Scrath moved in the front line versus how many were still climbing out of the wreck behind him. That's when the first turning point hit him. The swarm wasn't just numerous. It was coordinated. These weren't wild predators hunting on instinct. Something, somewhere was directing them. A hive mind, which meant if he could disrupt the signal or exploit the terrain to break their formation, their numbers could become a liability instead of a weapon. It was a theory, a desperate one, but it was the only card he had to play. He moved, staying low. He cut along a dry ravine that split the canyon floor, using the jagged rock walls to break line of sight. Behind him, the swarm surged forward, not chaotic, but eerily synchronized, like water finding every gap in a dam. His second turning point came fast and violent. A trio of Scrath broke off from the main group and flanked him through a side tunnel, faster than anything that size should move. He barely got a shot off before one lunged, claws raking across his shoulder plate hard enough to spin him into the rock wall. Pain flared white-hot down his arm. For one terrifying second, Ryden thought this was where it ended. 3 kilometers from safety, torn apart in a canyon nobody would ever find. Instead, something clicked into place. He rolled beneath the second Scrath to strike, put 2 rounds into the joint of his foreleg, and used his collapsing body as a shield against the third. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't heroic. It was survival math, solved in half a second. He staggered upright, chest heaving, blood running down his arm, and directly into his third turning point of the day, behind the retreating swarm. Deep in the canyon, his scanner picked up a second heat signature. A ship, freshly crashed. Emergency beacon still pulsing. He wasn't the only one stranded on Velura 4. Whoever or whatever was on that ship, they had no idea what was about to descend on them. And Ryden, wounded, outnumbered nearly 1,000 to 1, was the only thing standing between them and the swarm. He looked at his ammo counter, then at the endless wave of red eyes pouring down the canyon behind him. He had a choice to make, and no time left to make it. He had exactly one plan, barely tested, and 1,000 reasons it could fail. So why did Ryden Oaks suddenly look almost calm? With his shoulder throbbing and blood soaking through his sleeve, Ryden pressed his back against the canyon wall and forced himself to think instead of react. Running blindly toward his transport would get him killed within minutes. The swarm was too fast, too coordinated, and it was already cutting off his direct path. But running wasn't his only option anymore. He had terrain. He had a narrow ravine carved by centuries of runoff, barely wide enough for 3 Scrath to move through side by side. And he had numbers on his side in a way nobody would expect. The swarm's greatest strength, its overwhelming size, was about to become its greatest weakness. He began moving with purpose, deliberately staying just close enough to keep the Scrath's attention locked onto him, baiting them like a lure dragged through dark water. Every few hundred meters, he'd expose himself just long enough to draw a fresh wave forward, then vanish behind an outcrop before they could close the gap. It was a brutal, exhausting rhythm. Expose, retreat, redirect, repeat, and one mistake in timing would end everything. The first major turning point of his gambit came almost immediately. As he funneled a group of nearly 200 Scrath into the ravine's mouth, he realized a hive mind was adapting. A secondary group broke away entirely, climbing the canyon walls above him, trying to flank from high ground he hadn't accounted for. His clean, calculated trap was unraveling in real time. He didn't panic. He adjusted, firing 2 precise shots to collapse a weakened rock ledge. Ryden brought down a curtain of stone and dust directly into the flanking group's path, burying a dozen Scrath and forcing the rest to scramble for a new route, one that funneled him right back into the ravine with the others. It cost him nearly a quarter of his ammunition, reserved to pull off, a resource he could not afford to lose. That was his second turning point. The terrifying realization that surviving this fight meant constantly trading one limited resource for another, with no margin for error left in either column. By the time the bulk of the swarm had packed itself into the ravine, hundreds of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to spread out or flank. Ryden had reached the high ground above them, exactly where he wanted to be. He dropped into a crouch, breathing hard, and looked down at what was, for the first time since his nightmare began, a battlefield tilted in his favor. That's when his scanner buzzed again. The second heat signature he detected earlier was moving. Whoever had crash-landed nearby wasn't hiding. They were heading toward the noise, toward him. Completely unaware, they were walking straight into the edge of a 1,000-strong kill zone. His third turning point arrived like a gut punch. He now had 2 problems instead of 1. Hold his position and finish what he started, or break formation to warn the strangers before they stumbled into the swarm's outer edge and got themselves killed, undoing everything he'd fought to set up. Ryden made his decision the way he made every decision on a battlefield, fast and without looking back. He stayed, not out of coldness, but calculation. If he abandoned the ravine now, the trapped Scrath would scatter, regroup, and the fight would restart from zero, this time with him even more exposed. His only real chance to protect anyone, including himself, was to finish the trap and finish it now. He steadied his rifle, sighted the first target in the packed ravine below, and began firing in perfect, unhurried rhythm. Each round dropping a Scrath at the edge of the crowd, using confined space to create a bottleneck of bodies that blocked the ones behind from advancing. For a few minutes, it almost looked like it might work exactly as planned. Then the ground began to shake, not from the Scrath, from something much larger, moving fast, cutting across the canyon floor, directly toward the trap swarm, and directly toward him. Princess Thyra Solon had survived a crash landing on a planet with no rescue coming. What she saw next made her forget she was even afraid. Hours earlier, Thyra's royal transport had been forced down by a debris field none of her pilots had flagged in time. It wasn't supposed to happen. Royal shuttles carried the best navigational systems in the Coalition, and her elite guard detachment was handpicked from veterans of a dozen campaigns. And yet here she was, stranded on an unmapped world, her ship's hull scorched and unflyable, with no immediate way to signal for extraction. Her lead guard, a scarred veteran named Corvin, wanted her sealed inside the wreck at all costs. Thyra refused. She had never been the kind of royal who would behind rank, while others bled for her, and she wasn't about to start now. So when the ground began to rumble with something enormous moving through the canyon beyond their crash site, she was the one who insisted they investigate rather than retreat. That decision led to the first turning point of her day, cresting a ridge and looking down into a scene that made no logical sense. A single human soldier, alone wounded, standing above a ravine packed with what looked like an entire biomechanical army. And he wasn't running from it. He was directing it, herding it, controlling the flow of hundreds of hostile predators like a conductor in front of an orchestra of nightmares. That's not possible One of her guards whispered. Thyra said nothing. She simply watched. She had studied military doctrine her entire life, sat through briefings from decorated generals, memorized case studies of the coalition's greatest tacticians. None of it had prepared her for what she was seeing now. One man, 3 kilometers from safety, using terrain itself as a weapon against odds that should have ended him in the first 10 seconds. Her second turning point arrived when Corvin raised his rifle, ready to open fire and assist immediately. Thyra put a hand on his arm and stopped him. "Wait," she said quietly, not out of hesitation, but instinct. She needed to understand what she was looking at before her guards charged in and disrupted a plan they didn't yet comprehend. If the soldier's strategy was as deliberate as it looked, an uncoordinated attack from her side could unravel everything he'd built and get them all killed in the process. So they watched a little longer, and what they saw silenced every doubt in the group. The soldier below wasn't improvising out of desperation. Every shot he fired served a purpose. Every step he took closed off an escape route for the swarm, rather than opening one for himself. He was thinking 3 moves ahead of a 1,000-strong hive mind, and somehow, impossibly, he was winning. Then came the third turning point, the one that changed everything. A breakaway group of nearly 50 Scrath tore free from the main swarm and began climbing directly toward a ridge where Thyra and her guards stood exposed. The soldier below couldn't see it. He was too focused on holding the ravine formation to notice the new threat emerging behind him, a threat that was now barreling straight toward the one person in this fight nobody had planned on, her. Corvin raised his weapon again, this time with no hesitation, shouting orders to form a defensive line. Thyra's heart pounded, not from fear for herself, but from a sudden, sharp realization. If her presence here got her guards killed, or worse, disrupted the soldier's plan and let the swarm regroup, then everything he had risked his life to build would collapse in an instant, and it would be her fault. She had come to this ridge to understand a battle. Instead, she had just become part of it. Below them, oblivious of the new danger climbing toward his flank, Ryden Oaks kept firing into the ravine, unaware that the fate of his entire plan and the lives of the princess and her guards now hung on whether help arrived in the next 60 seconds or whether it arrived far, far too late. 60 seconds. That's all the time left before everything Ryden had built came crashing down, and he didn't even know it yet. The breakaway pack of Scrath surged up the ridge with terrifying speed, closing the distance on Thyra's position faster than her guards could establish a defensive line. Corvin barked orders, positioning his soldiers into a tight formation, but even veteran instincts couldn't hide the truth. 50 Scrath against 6 royal guards was a fight nobody wanted, in a place nobody had chosen, with backup that didn't know they existed. That was the first major turning point of the battle's final act. Thyra, refusing Corvin's order to fall back to the wreck, grabbed a sidearm from a fallen guard's kit and took position on the line herself. "If we run, they follow us straight to the ship," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We hold here or we lose everything." It wasn't a royal decree. It was a soldier's logic, and in that moment, nobody argued with her. Down in the ravine, Ryden felt the shift before he understood it. A change in the swarm's rhythm, a portion of its coordinated hunting pattern breaking away from his trap. He spun, scanned the ridge, and his stomach dropped. Strangers, under attack, exactly where his carefully built formation hadn't accounted for anyone else being. His second turning point hit like a hammer. He had 2 choices, and both were bad. Hold his position and let the ravine trap finish crushing the main swarm, risking the lives of strangers on a ridge, or abandon a plan that had cost him blood, ammunition, and nearly everything he had. To save people he'd never met, he chose in half a second, the same way he always did. Ryden broke from the ridge overlook and cut diagonally down the canyon wall, putting himself directly between the breakaway pack and the exposed guards, firing control bursts to draw their attention back onto himself. It worked immediately, and it worked too well. Nearly 30 Scrath redirected onto him at once, a wave of claws and armored limbs that no single soldier should have been able to face, let alone survive. That's when the third turning point of the sequence arrived, and it came from an unexpected direction. Thyra, instead of retreating to safety now that the immediate threat had shifted away from her position, ordered her guards to open fire in support, striking the redirected Scrath on the flank, while Ryden held them from the front. It was the exact crossfire tactic he'd been trying to build with terrain alone, except now it had a second army behind it, one he hadn't planned for and hadn't asked for, but one that arrived at precisely the moment he needed it most. The battlefield transformed in an instant. Scrath, caught between two disciplined lines of fire, had nowhere to retreat, no gap to exploit, no flank left unguarded. The very numbers that had made the swarm terrifying became the mechanism of its collapse. Trapped, pressed together, unable to maneuver, falling in waves under coordinated fire from both directions at once. Ryden fought through exhaustion and blood loss, every motion mechanical at this point, driven by nothing but training and sheer will. Beside him, though he didn't yet know her name, a stranger in torn royal armor fought with the same unshakable focus he did, matching his pace shot for shot as if they trained together for years instead of meeting in the middle of a massacre. Within minutes, the breakaway pack was gone. The main swarm in the ravine below, cut off from reinforcement and disoriented by the collapse of its flanking force, began to fracture and scatter for the first time since the fight began. The Battle of Velura was ending, but as the gunfire faded and the dust began to settle, Ryden turned to find himself face to face with the woman who had just fought beside him, and neither of them had any idea that the next 40 minutes would matter more than the entire battle that came before it. The battle was over. What happened in the silence afterward is the part of the story almost nobody knows. The canyon fell quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural after the chaos of the last few hours. Smoke drifted from scorched rock. The last scattered Scrath fled into the distance, their hive coordination broken beyond recovery. Ryden lowered his weapon, arms shaking from exhaustion, and finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of the wound on his shoulder. That's when Thyra approached him directly, lowering her own weapon, her guards fanning out behind her to secure the perimeter. She studied him for a long moment, not as royalty assessing a subordinate, but as one survivor recognizing another. "You did this alone," she said. "It wasn't a question. Before we ever arrived, you were already winning." Ryden allowed himself the smallest, tired smile. "I wasn't winning," he said. "I was buying time until I ran out of ideas or ran out of ammo, whichever came first." It was the first major turning point of this quieter chapter. The moment the legend of Galaxy would eventually build around him collided with the plain, unglamorous truth of how he actually saw himself. He hadn't seen himself as a hero. He'd seen a problem, and he'd solved it one variable at a time. Thyra found that answer more compelling than any grand declaration could have been. They didn't have the luxury of standing still for long. Her shuttle was damaged. His transport was still 3 kilometers away, and neither option could get them off Velura without repairs. So they made the only reasonable decision available. They worked together. Ryden's engineering knowledge from field repairs, combined with the technical specs of her guards' onboard toolkits, gave them a fighting chance to get her shuttle flight worthy again before nightfall, and before whatever else might be drawn to the wreckage of a crashed Raider ship. The second turning point came somewhere in the middle of that repair work, when Corvin pulled Thyra aside, quietly urging caution. A random soldier appearing in the middle of a royal crisis, however impressive his combat skill, was exactly the kind of variable that made palace security nervous. Thyra listened to the concern, respected it, and dismissed it anyway. "If he wanted to hurt me," she said, "he had 1,000 better chances in fixing my ship." It was a small moment, easy to overlook, but it marked something important. Thyra choosing trust over protocol, instinct over procedure, the same instinct that had made her step onto that ridge in the first place instead of hiding in the wreck. As the repairs continued, Ryden and Thyra found themselves talking, at first about tactics and terrain, then slowly about things that had nothing to do with the battle at all. He asked about her life before the crash. She asked what made a soldier calm enough to stare down 1,000-strong swarm without breaking. He told her, honestly, that calm wasn't the absence of fear. It was refusing to let fear make decisions for him. She told him that was the most honest answer to a question about courage she'd ever heard from anyone, soldier or general. 40 minutes passed like this. No official record would ever capture it. No history book would mention two strangers sitting on a scorched rock beside a half-repaired shuttle, talking quietly while the sun dipped toward the horizon of a planet that had almost killed them both. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just real, and that was exactly why it mattered. The The third turning point of this chapter arrived just as the shuttle systems flickered back to life. A distant signal, faint but unmistakable, crackled through Thyra's comm coalition rescue ships, alerted by the debris field, were finally inbound. Their moment, whatever it had been, was about to end the way all field moments do. Abruptly and without warning, Ryden stood, brushing dust from his uniform, already shifting back into the posture of a soldier awaiting extraction. Thyra watched with an expression she hadn't expected to feel toward a man she'd known for less than a day. Neither of them said what they were thinking, but both of them were already wondering the same thing. Would this be the only conversation they ever got? History would remember the battle. Only one person would remember the 40 minutes that actually mattered, and what she chose to do with that memory changed everything. The rescue ships arrived just as the last light faded over Velura, their spotlights sweeping across a canyon littered with the wreckage of a 1,000-strong swarm and the scorched hull of a raider vessel that had started it all. Coalition medics moved quickly, treating Ryden's wounds, securing the site, already documenting the scale of destruction with the kind of disbelief that would follow this story for years to come. Thyra gave her official statement with careful precision, describing the crash, the swarm, the coordinated defense that had saved her guards' lives. She credited Ryden fully and accurately for the tactical brilliance that had made survival possible in the first place. It was the first turning point of this final chapter. She told the truth completely, and yet somehow the full truth still wasn't the whole story, because nowhere in that official report did she mention 40 minutes beside a half-repaired shuttle. Nowhere did she describe a conversation about fear and calm and choices that had settled something in her she hadn't known was unsettled. Some things she decided belonged to her alone, not because they were secret, but because they were hers. In the weeks that followed, the story of Velura spread to the Coalition like wildfire. Analysts pored over sensor logs and satellite data, reconstructing Ryden's movements meter by meter, stunned by the precision of a plan built entirely on terrain, patience, and nerve. Military academies across a dozen systems began teaching the engagement as a case study within a month of the official report's release, the first verified instance of a single officer achieving total victory over a 1,000-unit swarm through pure tactical manipulation, with no reinforcements of his own. That was the second turning point of the aftermath. Ryden Oaks, a soldier who had genuinely believed he was simply solving a problem in front of him, woke up one day to find himself a household name across the galaxy. Reporters wanted interviews. Generals wanted consultations. Strangers wanted to shake the hand of the man who had, as the headlines put it, proven that one disciplined mind could outmaneuver an army. He accepted the attention with the same calm he'd shown in the ravine, grateful, but faintly bewildered that anyone found the truth more impressive than the reality he had actually felt in the moment. Thyra watched his rise from a careful distance, sending the occasional message, receiving the occasional reply. Nothing official, nothing that would appear in any court record or diplomatic file. Just two people who had survived something together, choosing to stay connected in whatever quiet way the demands of duty allowed. The third and final turning point came almost a year later, at a coalition ceremony honoring the anniversary of the battle. Ryden stood at the podium, medals pinned to a uniform he still wore like it didn't quite belong to him, delivering a short, understated account of what had happened on Velura 4. He didn't mention Thyra by name in his remarks, out of respect for her position. But when he stepped down from the stage, she was the first person he looked for in the crowd, and she was already looking back at him. They didn't need 40 minutes this time. A single glance said enough. The Battle of Velura became a permanent chapter in Coalition military history. The Day One soldier, alone and outnumbered 1,000 to 1, refused to let impossible odds dictate the outcome. Historians would spend years studying his tactics, his patience, his refusal to panic, when panic would have been the reasonable response. But for Thyra Solon, the greatest legacy of that battle was never the strategy or the medals or the case studies. It was a quiet, unremarkable conversation beside a broken shuttle. The moment an extraordinary friendship began, built not on the legend the galaxy would remember, but on the honest, ordinary truth of two people who had simply, finally, found someone who understood exactly what it meant to stay calm when everything said they shouldn't.